This video is going to be a quick review of the history that we've covered so far this year through the framework of George Washington's life. In other words, if we look at what George Washington was doing throughout various points of his life, we'll see that he was been involved in just about all of the history that we've covered so far this year. For a little bit of context, I added a date up at the top of this sheet. We want to know that Washington was born in 1732. That allows us to get an idea of how old he was at various points in time. All right, so first up, the French and Indian War, right? That's kind of where we started our year off. Remember, it was in the 1750s, and at this time, Washington was 22 years old. He was the one who, sort of warned the French that they needed to leave and really was at the forefront of this battle, this war beginning between the British and the French and Indians. This was a key event in history from our earlier perspective, of course, because it was the war that caused Britain to get into so much debt and therefore to pass all these taxes, which angered the colonists and so on and so forth. But it's also important to look at here that at a mere 22 years old, George Washington is working his way up through the British military and showing himself to be the military genius that we know is going to win us independence eventually. So that's 1754, right? A number of years later, after we get through all the taxes, all the riled up colonists, all that sort of stuff, the shot heard round the world happens, right? The fighting at Lexington and Concord. And this is the same year then when in response to that, the Second Continental Congress meets, and they appoint George Washington the commander of the Continental Army. So he's 43 years old at this point in time. He has left the British Army, decided he's going to fight against his former employers as the leader of the Americans trying to win their independence. We know within the very next year, the Declaration of Independence is getting written, getting signed by the men of the Second Continental Congress. And during this time, George Washington is in New York. He's training his troops. He's trying to ready these formerly militiamen to become a real fighting force that can take on the world's most powerful military at the time, the British. Then we move on, through the war. Of course, Washington is leading throughout the years of the war, running his spy networks, doing all sorts of his great military stuff that he did to help the Americans win this war. In 1781, that's the final victory at Yorktown, when the British are surrounded by Washington's troops on land and the French Navy at the sea. And it takes a couple of years, of course, for the Treaty of Paris to be finalized and for Americans to truly have their independence. During this time, I put a little note AFC off to the side there because our government's running under the Articles of Confederation at this point in time, right? Our first Constitution. We know the Articles of Confederation didn't work out that well for a multitude of reasons that we've already studied. So in 1787, the Constitutional Convention happens. Remember, that's what we reenacted in our room where all of you had roles. We used our script. And I played the role of George Washington, who was the president, the leader of that convention, and really helped guide the writing of the Constitution. When that's done, and the Constitution 88, sorry, I don't know what happened to the camera there, but the Constitution gets ratified in 1788, and Washington really would like to retire at this point. He's been a busy man for 35 years serving his country, whether that was the British military or the Americans militarily and then politically. But there's such a concern, as we know, about who is going to get our country off to a good start, who's going to be that executive that's going to show we can have a strong leader who doesn't have to behave like a king. And Washington is really sort of pushed into serving his country somewhat against his will and inaugurated the first president of the United States in 1789. He serves 2 terms, and we're going to look in this upcoming unit at a lot of the things that happened during those terms. But he announces that he's going to retire in 1796, so he doesn't run for re-election that year. And he's 64 years old at this point, and he is finally able to retire to his home in Mount Vernon, where he can pursue some of his true loves. Farming, he was a big farmer, you'll see, those of you who visit his home in Mount Vernon. He liked to invent. He had all sorts of other passions as well. Unfortunately, he did not get to pursue these for very long because a mere 3 years later, he died at his home in Mount Vernon when he was 67 years old. Incredible when you look at this sheet and all of the key history of our country that Washington not only lived through, but really was a leader through. So he's a pretty amazing man, and we're going to, as I said, take a closer look at his time in the early 1790s as president.